If you want to understand the complexity of the beauty in The Last of Us, look no longer than into your own humanity. Understanding the conflict of human nature is the key sentiment of this story. It was the great poet Pablo Neruda who said, "To feel the love of people whom we love." Come on, Ellie. The year is 2013. The PS3 is waiting to be rolled into the retirement home as the PS4 will be released later this year. But Naughty Dog has one last swan song to give it before it sails away to the undying lands. Fresh off the success of the Uncharted series, Naughty Dog was on a roll and had been working on something called Project Thing in secret since 2009. Now, 4 years later, after an E3 trailer and some delays, it was ready for release. But with giant titles like GTA 5, Battlefield 4, Tomb Raider, Call of Duty Ghosts, Bioshock Infinite and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, could a new IP make a name for itself?
And the winner is... Naughty Dog!
Oh man, this is rigged.
With Bioshock Infinite, gone.
Absolutely stunning. The atmospheric, The Last of Us.
This wasn't even close.
The Last of Us.
We talk about video games that help shape the industry and change the way we told stories and change the way people thought of this medium. They're going to talk about The Last of Us.
And I'm in the office, it's all Uncharted 4 all the time. When I should be sleeping, it's the Uncharted movie.
The Last of Us movie, you mean?
Yeah, the Last of Us movie.
The existence of The Last of Us TV show brings up a lot of questions. First of all, is it really necessary? Do we really need this? Does the story work without player agency? Why is it on HBO? Is Pedro Pascal the universal Sadie? Does it really deserve 25 Emmy nominations? So, of course, during this winter, I was watching this show and I was enjoying it, as was everyone else. Watching this show every Monday with friends and seeing these two characters traversing through the US was a highlight every week. But as I kept reading on Twitter and following the discussions online praising the show, I kept questioning, like, yeah, the show is great and all, but the game's better, right? I mean, it's one of the best games I've ever played. I had a similar experience while watching The Batman last year, and while I enjoyed watching the film quite a lot, I was sitting in the cinema thinking, cool stuff, but The Dark Knight does this better, right? Or The Dark Knight is still a league above. So I had to check for myself and rewatch The Dark Knight alone a couple of weeks later. And yikes, this was not the Dark Knight I remembered. Amazing when it came out? Yes, absolutely. Heath Ledger's performance will be remembered forever. But boy, if there isn't some room for improvement on this masterpiece. From logical fallacies in the plot, performances that go all over the place, to shots that are just way too long and weird. So after I suffered similar feelings of comparison when watching The Last of Us as I did The Batman, I figured I have to replay the games. I'm sure it isn't nostalgia clouding my eyes and it isn't a Dark Knight situation all over again. So right now the plan is to replay the game on PS4, then watch the show again, and then replay the game again on PC, this time The Last of Us Part 1 Remaster. I don't have access to a PS3 right now, so we won't be doing the original release, but the PS4 version is pretty close. So yeah, I just sold my $120 AVP Asimov on the Steam market, so I don't actually have to spend any cash on games. I'm gonna consume all this media over the next period, so yeah, I'll see you on the other side. Let's start with Spores. In the games, It was the main source of infection, except biting, turning the host into a little factory of spore emission. The show killed that. The producers said that it would make sense if this thing was airborne, because it would be over for the humans in a matter of days. Alright, I guess, but in the game at least, it's very convincing that it's been able to fester in these small places and become deadly over time, and everyone has to use a gas mask for protection. This removal does also raise some issues in the story, as at least The Last of Us 2 has some pretty important, small but important plot reveals related to the use of gas masks in the world. But so does The Last of Us Part 1. One of the reasons that Joel chooses to believe Ellie quite quickly after Tess dies is because they hide from Fedra in the situation and encounter Spores, where Joel has to wear a mask but Ellie can breathe just fine, giving him solid evidence for her immunity without having to just believe her. I think the use of gas masks was also part of what made The Last of Us stand out in the oversaturated zombie apocalypse 2010s media hellscape. The Spores were something of a fresh element with their limitation to dark, enclosed and small spaces, kind of like mushroom in real life. It also had an added effect of forming the aesthetic of the game. The Spores would show and animate whenever you transition through scenes, waiting on a loading screen or starting a new game. In the show, we get a mushroom hive mind instead. The infected are a part of a network that can communicate through roots over long distances. Maybe it's just me, but this does feel a bit more sci-fi or alien-like. However, in the game, the villain is just nature, an unstoppable force fighting and growing back, while the addition of the hive mind makes it seem more like an intelligent life form trying to take over the world with plans and a purpose. And the added dynamic of the show setting up Ellie as a leader to battle this enemy in some sort of combat for the endgame feels a bit more like a stereotypical Hollywood sci-fi action flick. Another big difference between the show and game is the reduction of action scenes and kills we see on screen, especially Joel's kills. In game, Joel is a murdering tank, getting around 300 kills on an average playthrough, depending a bit on how you play. Show Joel, however, has around 40, thanks to YouTuber Epic Caves Gaming for crunching those numbers. A critique a friend of mine had was that he found it hard to believe that Joel would go on and solo the entire hospital in a killing spree after struggling to only kill a handful of people at most before that. He actually gets more kills in the hospital sequence alone than the rest of the show put together. It does feel very different in game, as there's always a shootout sequence after almost everything you do, to the point of annoyance in some cases. And this old ass 50-something-year-old man handles it more effortlessly than I could ever dream of. But the in-game killings, and especially the finale, take on some added context in the game. As you go through the world, you build your arsenal more and more, gaining perks through eating pills and take on stronger and stronger enemies. Then you twist it by having you use that gained arsenal on the quote good guys in the end. While it is some of the hardest fights in the game, it also kind of juxtaposes how you've been building your arsenal fighting bad guys, gaining XP or whatever, and when that arsenal is immensely powerful and extremely dangerous, you turn it on the good guys. You have to remember that a decent amount of players hated this ending. This was during a period in the gaming space where alternate and choice endings were becoming the standard, with games like the Mass Effect trilogy, GTA 5, Telltale's Walking Dead, Skyrim, Infamous 2, Heavy Rain, Dishonored, Dragon Age and Far Cry 3 all left a choice for how you dealt with the ending, taking it into player agency. In The Last of Us, your hand was forced. You had to kill the kind Firefly soldiers and sacrifice the cure to get to the end. While in other games you might have been given a choice in this situation, but you were locked into playing Joel's story. Now, Even though the game decides the ending for you, the amount of enemies you kill is on you for the most part. There are, of course, some situations where you're forced to kill enemies, but in most instances you can sneak past enemy patrols and totally avoid them, putting the brutality of Joel a little bit on your shoulders. Looking back, I can definitely see that the amount of kills and action set pieces in the game is on the high end and would look almost cartoony in the show. But the show went a little hard in the other direction, as by the end we kind of forget that it's a zombie show, because we haven't seen a zombie in 3 episodes, which in turn kind of devalues the sacrifice for the cure. In the game, you constantly are reminded of the cordyceps because you persistently have to deal with and be annoyed by the infected directly. Fucking clicker. The last change I want to talk about is a bit more subtle. Ellie comes out of the gate a bit more hardened and violent compared to her in-game counterpart, which is a bit more innocent and has a wondrous outlook on the world. Show Ellie doesn't really change that much from the first time we see her to the last time we see her, while game Ellie does. Especially in situations that Joel tends to put her through inadvertently, where his violence tends to shock her. This adds an extra level of responsibility and guilt on the player on how Ellie has forcefully been hardened throughout the game and how that might affect her future, strengthening the bond between player and Ellie. While for Joel, the change goes a bit in the other direction. I guess in an attempt to make him more likable, they took away some of his harshness and brutality. I guess you could say that the show made both Ellie and Joel a little less contrasting. Joel becomes a little less brutal, loses some of his coldness, while Ellie loses a bit of her innocence and her wonder with the world. In general, I don't have much to nitpick with episode 1 and 2, they are mostly pretty good. Of course, episode 1 is a bit long, but that's because it was originally intended to be 2 different episodes, one alone with the whole prologue, but they deemed it too bleak and hopeless to end the pilot episode with Sarah's death, which is understandable, to say the least. There's some minor annoyances, like the lack of subtlety when Joel kills the first guard, like, are we gonna believe that he has this pent-up rage over 20-some years, and at this exact moment, a guard pointing at him with a flashlight, that's where you explode. There's also an insert flashback shot here of Sarah, which feels jarring, as do the TV show intro. But, I mean, that is nitpicky. Except for an awkward kiss and some atrocious green screen, I think episode 2 is pretty flawless. We see some of the best scenes between Ellie and Joel here. Plus, the set design, especially in the hotel lobby, is a straight-up carbon copy of the game. Bill and Frank's episode is very sweet and dramatic, and I think this is one of the changes that really work. While his relationship with Frank was more subtle or left to interpretation in the game, it does make sense that what we see in the show is what will happen before Ellie and Joel cross their paths in the game. When you meet Bill in the game, he and Frank have recently had a falling out, leading to Frank eventually leaving Bill, but you can tell that they had a closer relationship, stronger than friendship. I was surprised by how alike the show Bill and game Bill were. It does indeed feel like an extension of the character, even though we see them in very different environments. It's still the exact same character. Game Bill, however, has to endure an hour-long search for a car battery with Joel and Ellie, barely surviving by the end, while show Bill lives his life mostly in harmony and chills with his boyfriend. One thing I, however, feel is a loss with the change in the show is the interactions between Ellie and Bill. These are some of the more humorous lines in the game, and their uneasiness around each other is a dynamic that is surely missed. And even though in the game we feel like we are building up a relationship and warming up to Bill during our adventure in his town to get the car, he surely reminds us that we are not welcome here in the end, and we get another reminder of how cold and unforgiving this world is.
About your buddy back there, that's a tough deal.
We square?
We're square.
Then get the fuck out of my town.
In the game, the part of Bill's coldness also take a pivotal role in forming our view on Joel. There was a warmth in Bill once, with his relationship with Frank that we get a glimpse of when we find Frank's body. He is a more defeated version of Joel, a Joel who has lost everything and will no longer be friendly towards anyone. Even though the sequences with Bill from TV and game are way different, they fill each other out. They both serve the plot with some minor motivation and character build for Joel. It is the same character. But in the game, his part of shaping Joel is being a representation of what not to be. A bitter old man who has given up on the world. While in the show, him and his relationship with Frank embodies the representation of what to aspire to be. A protector who learned to live through a different person. Two different ways to set Joel on the same path towards where he ends up in the finale. I do also want to say that in the game, one big part of Bill's town area is that while he uses traps and tripwires to defend himself, he also uses the infected as a defensive mechanism, scaring away raiders and moving in between them. Removing this defense from the equation not only removes the amount of infected we see on screen in the show, which is already extremely limited, but also takes away a unique way to deal with them or handle them in this world. There are more changes to episode 4 and 5 than simply changing the city from Pittsburgh to Kansas City. Sam's age is a pretty distinct change, making him younger so Ellie comes more across as an older sister, whilst in the game it's more of an equal or teenage flirt. While I like the new version of Sam and Henry and the performances by their actors, there's more of a relationship built with these two in the game as they have more screen time with Ellie and Joel. They experience more events together, like Sam and Ellie playing darts while you're running around looting, him kind of flirting with Ellie trying to impress her, or Henry leaving you for dead then coming back to save you. There's also a part after Henry's betrayal where the four of you are split up and Joel ends up with Sam and Henry with Ellie, where the trust is really rebuilt when you meet back up, making the finale of their plot even more devastating. There's also the slight change of Ellie learning of Sam's infection. In the game, we as the players are the only ones it's revealed to. In the show, this changes to Ellie actually trying to heal Sam with her blood, and while it does look borderline naive of her, it does solidify Ellie's strong motivation for continuing the journey and making the cure. Perhaps even a willingness for self-sacrifice to make it happen. This notion is further implied by the final scene right after this, where I think the first time Ellie says "Come on, let's go," to Joel, signifying her newfound motivation to get to the lab. All of this adds some extra context for Ellie's motivation, which I liked. There were also things I did not like about Kansas City, and that was, you guessed it, the flashbacks. Most of the plot with Kathleen I simply did not care about. They also changed the people controlling this town a bit. While they have similar stories of revolting against Fedra after being treated inhumanly, the group in the game is a bit rougher. While the show gang seems like they're well equipped and not too far from being decent folk. The game's enemies in this area are a bit different. They seem to only gain resources through robbing passerbys, and they always kill them, stacking up quite the body count. And personally, I do think they're a bit more intimidating since they're all men and look like crackheads. Don't get me wrong, women can be scary too. But watching this episode gave me nowhere near the fear and anger as when I played this part myself. This is one of the parts in the game where I kill every NPC that I can, because these hunters, as they're called, are so evil and merciless that I don't trust them to be alive around other people. These Kansas City episodes also had one of the weirdest action scenes I've seen in a minute, where the good guys are walking straight in the open, no one is shooting at them, then they try to hide behind the car in the open, and Henry talks to Kathleen from behind this car, and they're like, where is he? Where is this voice coming from?
Just let the kids go.
No. Sorry. The girl is with the man.
The whole sequence felt surreal and weird. Then we get a Deus Ex Machina at the end, so our gang can get away without a scratch, I guess. The whole plot of Henry stealing medicine for his brother and kind of ratting out or sacrificing a whole group of rebels for it became a little too much of an on-the-nose premonition for where Joel is going to end up in the end. I think the 5th episode especially could have gained a lot from not doing or limiting the flashbacks, and instead focus on building the Sam and Henry relationship with Joel and Ellie. Maybe even include the betrayal, where Henry ditches us but Ellie is like fuck that and sticks with us. His logic of you would have done the same if you were in my position is something Joel silently agrees to in-game. On the other hand, one thing I like about this change of Henry sacrificing a rebellion leader for Sam is it does gives a more clean line to Henry's suicide in the end. It's almost to the point of irony, where you sacrifice a revolution for your little brother, and then when that little brother dies, all that sacrifice has in a way been in vain. It adds an extra layer of tragedy to the whole scenario. There are a lot of good performances in the show. All around, pretty much everyone is bringing their A game. But to me at least, Gabriel Luna stands out. He is Tommy to a T. The phone call from the first episode sounds like it's straight out ripped out of the game.
Yeah?
But I'm in jail. God damn it. What's my fault this time? I was at the bar, some guy goes crazy, starts swinging at a waitress. I stepped in, knocked him out, cops show up. Look, it doesn't fucking matter. You gotta bail me out.
Hello?
Sarah, honey, I need to get your daddy on the phone.
Uncle Tommy, what time is it?
I need to talk to your dad now. There's something.
I think most people who have an intimate relationship with the game would agree that this is the one character in the show that feels the most true to its game counterpart. In the game, so much happens between the start and Tommy's part that I don't blame you if you forgot who he was by the time he shows up. The show is a little better at constantly reminding us that he is still alive and kicking, but he might be in trouble. Jackson looks perfect and is perhaps my favorite set in the show, like no notes. Even though we technically don't really see it in game, we are instead on Tommy's dam. I think the location change makes sense, as do the removal of the action sequences in this section. I would have liked to see more kills, thrilling action and a better conclusion at the college, but a man can't have it all, I guess. The game has a tendency to make everything dissolve into a gunfight in a lot of areas, especially in parts of heightened dialogue where things are about to turn very sour. Joel and Tommy is about to throw hands, and then it's oh shit, we have to turn our attention to the raiders that just walked in.
The hell is that?
We're under attack.
I would say that those action sequences are mostly fluid, mostly okay, but there is a section in this part of the game where Ellie runs away on a horse as she learns that Joel intends to dump her off on Tommy, and what should just be a quick follow the tracks mission turns into a raider ambush and a two-part shooting gallery out of nowhere. It feels disjointed and weird in the game, so while I prefer Troy Baker's and Ashley Johnson's delivery of the "you are not my daughter" dialogue, I think as a whole this chapter or episode flows better in the show. To me, the strength and the core of this story, The Last of Us Part 1, game, show, haunted house, theater, whatever, is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Watching it grow, and we also, while playing as Joel, learning to love this character of Ellie and almost understand his sacrifice in the end. I think the fault of both the Left Behind and Long Time episodes is dragging our eyes away from this relationship. Now, the Left Behind episode in itself, however, is very good, and one of the stronger ones of the season, I would argue. It feels extremely true to the game, and Storm Reed steals the show as Riley, while Bella Ramsey also holds her ground impressively in perhaps the episode which is most oriented around her character. But there's a reason as to why it was released as DLC after the game, because it only functions as a break inside the game itself, a pause from the main story. One of the things that connected this part in the game was the fact that Ellie was looking for medicine for Joel in an all snow-covered mall, and then it connects through location to her backstory with Riley in the Boston QC shopping mall. When the show removed that connection, it does feel a bit more like telling a completely unrelated Ellie backstory while Joel is dying on the floor. So here's what I would do if I was in the director's chair on this show. Okay, bear with me for a second. You take the DLC episode, Left Behind, and you move it to the first episode of Season 2. So the first episode of Season 2 is just flashback, until there's like 10 minutes left. You have the scene where they are kind of holding hands, they are dying, ready to die, whatever, and then you move the camera slowly up. It's not Riley and Ellie, it's Dina and Ellie now, and they're older. You show Dina kind of smiling, and then Ellie kind of uncomfortable, like she doesn't deserve this. She doesn't feel she can let her guard down. And then you roll the credits. Thank you. Making this episodic change purely came to me as a gamer. Had I not been a gamer, I would not be standing in front of all you here today. Episode 8, the one with David and the cannibal group, is one of the stronger ones from the show. I maybe said that 3 times now, but who cares? I think it still falls short compared to the game in most aspects, but the tension is there, and James or Troy Baker's character addition is a welcome aspect of the conflict. I feel like show David is a bit more grounded in the world compared to the cartoon caricature that is the game version of him. No disrespect to Nolan North's performance, but comparing the two, one definitely has more depth to him. One huge missing part of this episode, though, for me, however, is the infected fight in the sawmill that happens in-game. This is right after Ellie first meets James and David, while James is out looking for medicine back at camp, and Dave and Ellie get a bit more warmed up to each other. When this infected surprise attack happens in-game, not only do we see that David had a pistol on him, which he could have used anytime on Ellie while they waited, they also save each other a bunch of times during this sequence and have a final standoff together against the infected in one of the most hardest bullshit fights in the game. While I'd admit the whole action sequence is a bit too large and feels like something out of World War C at times, it still makes us connect more with David. Both in the game and the show, there is an uneasiness about David and James when you first meet them. They don't look like trustable fellas. But in the game, you kinda forget about that, since David has been your ride or die for the last 20 minutes. Making the betrayal reveal hit even harder in the game as it catches you more off guard. There's also more guilt felt to David's words here when he accuses us of killing his men. As in game, we kill probably around 20-ish of his men at the college, while in the show, one guy dies. I do also want to point out to a small change when it comes to the ending, where in the show, Joel and Ellie don't meet until she exits the lodge, while in the game, Joel comes in and rescues Ellie mid-David's slice. I think what the showrunners are trying to say with the change is that Ellie doesn't need saving. She can handle her own, and having a tender pause inside a burning building doesn't make perfect sense. But I do feel like the emotional beats of this sequence hits harder in the game. In the show, we're at the edge of our seats at an emotional high point when Ellie overpowers David and turns him into sliced beef. Then we get a small but significant pause to breathe, where the adrenaline fades, Ellie steps outside, takes a moment to get some fresh air before being reunited with Joel. In the game there is no break. Joel gets into the room too late to save her physically, but has to emotionally save her instead. The dialogue gradually fades into music, and we only then get a chance to catch our breath.
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay. Joel. It's okay.
In my opinion, this change makes it so the show doesn't reach the emotional high point of the game. The intro is alright. Seeing the inclusion of Ashley Johnson giving birth to Ellie is a sweet tribute, but I feel like this whole sequence is another instance of the show not leaving things up to interpretation and being heavy-handed in its storytelling. Showing why Ellie is immune, showing how deeply invested Marlene has been with her from the start, and the death of Ellie's mother, it's like, did you really have to show us all this? Don't you trust us to put the pieces together ourselves a little bit? Throughout the game, you have to work a lot with Ellie to get over different small challenges. Getting over boxes, climbing stuff, lifting planks, moving ladders. And these kind of mini puzzles often involve boosting Ellie up somewhere. After doing this for around a dozen times, it eventually leads to this scene late in the game, where you expect everything to go as normal and Ellie coming over for a boost. yet she doesn't. She sits distracted, still shaken by the events of the winter. It's a moment that perfectly plays to the player's expectations and surprises them, showing that irreparable change has occurred, breaking the game loop to visualize it. The show doing this without the context of the boost feels like a significant downgrade, trying to replicate a moment the show has not earned. This is also together with a criticism I have where Joel and Ellie don't really problem solve that much together. It's mostly just Joel doing something or them just simply walking and talking. A couple more scenes with them working together to get across somewhere, defuse a trap or something, would do wonders to see their grown reliance on each other. And guess what? You could do it like in the game, where you give them dialogue at the same time as doing this little puzzle, instead of having every scene of dialogue be by a campfire or while walking together. On another note, the "it wasn't time that did it" dialogue is some of the best in both the show and game in my opinion, so props on that. In the game, there is a sequence in the finale after killing the doctor where you carry Ellie away from the fireflies. You have bright flashlights trailing you, bullets singing by, it's dark with red blinking alarm lights going off, and the best song from the game is playing, All Gone, No Escape. Being a direct callback to the intro with Joel and Sarah, where you have the bright floodlights being placed around the area, All Gone Aftermath on the soundtrack, running past a blinking red ambulance, only to end up facing the stick end of a flashlight, assault rifle and an army uniform. The callback to this moment in the end of the game makes it clear that this is where Joel's mind is when he's running here, almost reliving the exact same memory but refusing to accept it. It's almost like it's denial when it happens. Joel has Ellie in his hands and just does a light jog to get her out of there, refusing to let it happen again. That whole emotional part of the finale is nowhere to be seen in the show. We get a muted action scene and they totally skip this whole sequence. In my opinion, this is another example of the game doing visual storytelling extremely well, while the show relies on direct dialogue and flashbacks a bit too much. I also want to add that the whole composition in the basement here feels a lot cleaner in the game. In the show, Marlene's entrance is a bit awkward, like she's stepping out of the shadows. While in game, I mean, take a look yourself.
Can't keep her safe forever. You can't save her. Even if you get her out of here, then what?
The story in The Last of Us 1 is pretty simple. Dystopian future, some illness, one girl can be the cure and one man has to transport that girl cross country to potentially save humanity. We've seen similar stuff before, but what was new this time was the incredible bond that forms between these two characters in such a natural and charming way. Growing to learn to like or even love a stranger over time being the main plot of your story works so exceptionally well in the video game. Not only is this whole experience pretty long, from 10 to 15 hours depending on how much of a pro gamer you are, but having the character of Ellie gradually go from annoying brat we have to look after to her aiding you out more in combat as you're progressing really helps subconsciously convince my gamer brain that I do really care for this kid and appreciate her company. There was a discourse quite recently about how much character help you when you're stuck on puzzles and how annoying it can be. All of these examples are mostly from games released after the first Last of Us, and I can't help but think that they try to somehow replicate the back and forth seen in The Last of Us without really nailing it. When it comes to puzzles in The Last of Us, Ellie's or other NPCs' input on what to do aren't really that invasive. They're short and vague enough so that you don't feel spoken to like a child.
Hey, there's one of those floating raft things again. Can we use it?
There's also usually some minor character bonding sprinkled between Joel and Ellie or whoever is in the scene as well. But in general, The Last of Us is much more comfortable with having silence than those other games. During promotion of the show, there was a quote going around where one of the producers said that most games are pretty simple. You jump on enemies, you die, you insert another quarter to continue. The Last of Us changed that. And while this is an insanely unformed statement to make, I think I can, in a way, give him some points on it. At least to me, The Last of Us was the first video game that could rival TV and movies when it came to writing and performances. The dialogue, the world building, the acting, it's on at least the same level as some of the best we've seen on the cinematic screen. And that's kind of what The Last of Us changed. Now a video game could take up deeply adult and serious themes and win prestigious awards for acting and writing. And then, at least to me, it becomes kind of weird that that is the video game you want to base a show on. One that in some ways already is a show. I would say that the story's arc for Joel is built around a hierarchy of sacrifice for Ellie. We start off at the bottom of the pyramid. What are the first things that Joel partially or inactively sacrifices for Ellie? Well, it's his own safety and Tess's, mostly led on by Tess herself. But Joel does not really value his own existence at this point, so sacrificing himself is pretty low on the pyramid. Then it's his friends, represented by dragging an innocent Bill into the plot. Then it's his family, when he convinces Tommy to take Ellie to the laboratory. Then it's the future of humanity itself, when he refuses to give her up for the cure. And then at the top, it's his own relationship with Ellie that he sacrifices when he chooses to lie about the events that transpired in the hospital with the Fireflies at the end of the game. It's a gradual increase in stakes that works across both mediums. It's kind of interesting twist when you look at it this way. He would in the end sacrifice everything for Ellie's survival and well-being, even his own relationship with her. I have quite a few acquaintances who started on show like The Witcher, liked it quite a bit and then tried The Witcher 3, only to look back at the show with disgust. The main difficulty in adapting a rich story and world to the screen is the amount of cuts you have to make, side plots you have to abandon, characters and details you have to leave out whilst telling a cohesive story. I think there can be similar complaints to both The Witcher and The Last of Us when it comes to the visual world building. There's a feeling of cleanliness to everything. The costumes do not look worn. The sets feel a bit empty, like there is no world outside of what is currently within the camera frame. In The Witcher 3, there's a distinct identity to the world. The wooden huts have old dream catchers, pots and pans on the walls. Clothes for civilian NPCs are primarily bright green, red, blue and white colors, showing some resemblance to traditional Polish clothing. In The Witcher show, it's mostly dark blue, dark brown, dark grey or leather, leaving us with a feeling of a more generic fantasy than any specific region, time period or culture. Combine this with the blandness of the sets and it feels very much like Hollywood's generic version of middle-aged Eastern Europe. Or not even Eastern Europe, just like fantasy middle-aged location or a random D&D campaign. Whilst the game bleeds Polish through and through. While not as criminal, The Last of Us is guilty of similar offenses. The locations feel a lot more generic dystopian than its game counterpart. The game feels very much alive. You have the overgrown, regrown plant life. You have notes from other scavengers and threats lurking around every corner. In the game, this works really well as a kind of juxtaposition. You have the beautiful regrown plant life against the brutal, violent world of The Last of Us. Most of that is lacking in the show. You have shots where it looks like someone just put a branch on top of a car and called it a day. You have the whole world looks kind of empty and desolate. While in the game they're making like paths, like in a wholly original way. Like due to blocked roads and other things, paths and shortcuts now go through buildings and they've lasted for multiple decades. It's almost like when you go out into nature and you go a lot on a grassy area and it becomes a path, except that it's inside buildings and through solid concrete. Aesthetically, for me, I would love to see something more similar to Annihilation, for instance. Another part of the infection that I love to see more of is, in the game at least, there's places where the infected are they're crying and they're kind of showing emotion as they're eating other humans, showing that they might be conscious while still infected. Now, this would of course add a level of bodily horror and extreme violence to the world, but I feel like, I don't know, it's that added layer of horror that the show might need. While a small detail, it is an interesting added layer that adds depth and makes the world seem more brutal and horrifying. Also, in the intro for the game, for instance, there is a short voice line by Marlene or some other Firefly telling us to rise up and look for the light. And the quality of this audio file just builds up so much of the Fireflies in like 3 seconds without having to really show them at all.
You can still rise with us. Remember, when you're lost in the darkness, look for the light. Believe in the Fireflies.
There is a discussion to be made here about live adaptation of video games failing to faithfully replicate the video game's aesthetic, but that's a video for another time. An aesthetic choice of the game is that it utilizes to a strong degree hard cuts after more emotional scenes, like Sam and Henry's death, Sarah's death, David's death, Joel's injury. While they are signifying a new act or chapter, they also serve, at least to me, like some sort of reflection of the brutality of the world. Like it's subconsciously saying, this is just another day in the world of The Last of Us. There's brutality everywhere, no happy ending, and we make no friends. Even Joel's relationship with his brother is estranged and rough. The game, in a stronger sense, makes it feel like Ellie is the only sparkle of goodness and hope in the world because of this. Like, to an extent, there isn't much worth saving in this dark world except for Ellie, which perfectly plays into the ending of Joel's journey. When you have one of the best video game soundtracks of all time at your disposal and you choose not to use it, it's hopefully with good reason. That's not always the case. There's some that especially stick out, like Take On Me in episode 7 with the elevator scene.
Oh, cool! Backwards.
You have Max Richter's on The Nature of Daylight at the end of episode 3, which has become a pretty overused song and a cheap trick for a quick emotional gut punch. And while it does close out Bill and Frank's relationship, it's at the cost of minimizing their identity to genericness. We also have a song that plays at the end of episode 6, which is Jessica Mason's cover of Depeche Mode's Never Let Me Down Again, a callback to episode 1. The cover is fine and could very well fit in another TV show.
I'm taking a ride with my best friend.
But the lyric, I'm taking a ride with my best friend, I hope it never lets me down again, in this moment just feels too on the nose and out of place, especially with a layered vocal Billie Eilish sounding production. If you're gonna have music in this show, it's kind of world breaking when it sounds so modern and the world was supposed to have ended in 2003. At least for me, this kind of cover immediately takes me to a reality where TikTok exists. Just use All Gone Seasons like they did in the game, or something like The Choice from the soundtrack. Both songs that carry emotional quiet scenes like the one at the end of episode 6.
Oh, get up, get up, get up. You gotta tell me what to do. Come on, you gotta get up. Joel!
I can't help but theorize that a lot of these changes from the game to the show's direction was made due to Bruce Straley not being associated with the show. Now, if you haven't heard the name Bruce Straley before, I don't blame you. Neil Druckmann is usually the only one mentioned when you bring up The Last of Us and direction. But Bruce Straley was the actual game director for the original game, while Neil was only the creative director and writer. Now it gets a bit icky on exactly who was responsible for what in development, but while they may have had different roles on paper, there was a lot of overlap between the different departments, and it's been quoted that Bruce served as a sort of editor for Neil's writing, while also contributing with changes himself. I find it strange that someone who played such a huge part in creating the original story is not even credited when that story is interpreted on the big screen. In an interview about the show with LA Times, Straley puts it in context with IP ownership. It's an argument for unionization that someone who was part of the co-creation of that world and those characters isn't getting a credit or a nickel for the work they put into it. It's kind of weird that while the game is based on books and movies, the show is simply based on the game. And to that regard, the performances are based on already acted out performances done perfectly by Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson. It becomes similar to recreating a play. The performances will mirror those of the original actors, because the writing and direction itself was influenced by those actors' performances, their inputs on the dialogue and changes to the characters that they felt made sense. This can perhaps minimize the range that Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey can utilize, as it becomes partly mimicking or cosplaying another performance. There are some quotes from Neil Druckmann and others in game development that talk about how much the actors changed the characters from how Naughty Dog envisioned them. It might feel more natural through the game performances, as the characters were in larger degree shaped by the actors. Druckmann has been quoted saying, with Joel for example, "My idea was originally that he didn't care at all for Tess, this woman who he's partnered with in the quarantine zone. But Troy disagreed with me and said, you know, Joel's broken and he needs someone." That led to this really great performance. And we have a character who's gay, but it was the actor that made that decision. I left it vague on purpose so the actor could interpret it, and when we did the table read, they were like, yeah, this character is gay. And we went in and changed some scenes to reflect that. I told the actors if ever there was a line we could do without, let's cut the line. The easiest thing to convince me of is to do less. When you have performances with that much liberty for the actors and the ability to nitpick details like the angle of an eyebrow or the twitching of an eye in post-production, you create something that is hard to replicate correctly. And it puts the showrunners in a difficult spot. Do we want to do things differently from the game and have fans be mad at us for changing things? Or do we want to try to keep it as similar as possible and be compared frame by frame to the original game? There are definitely some negative parts to say about the game and the way the game is designed about telling this emotionally grounded story. At least when it comes to my gamer brain, I'm always constantly running around the different areas looking for collectibles or some weapon upgrade. Even when you're running from an enemy or there is a fake threat of we really need to get out of here, there's usually some in-game reward to ignoring that threat and looking around for loot. How to balance these in-game mechanics, I'm not sure, but I can tell you one thing, it pulls me out of the dramatic storytelling. And sure, I can ignore it and kind of RP my way through the game, but my gamer brain would not let me rest if I had the feeling that I missed some essential gun upgrade or instruction manual in the previous room that could have made this current fight much easier. The game also has a tendency to make some fights a bit comically large and arcadey. Especially the Ellie plus David versus Infect fight, Joel sniping an endless horde of hunters then an endless horde of infected, or the completely unnecessary fight when following runaway Ellie on horseback. The game also has its fair share of slow parts that feel like a chore to get through, especially after some high emotional set piece and then you have to sneak up on a deer for the next 10 minutes. When it comes to the difference between the original game or the PS4 remaster and The Last of Us Part 1 PC port, there's not really that much to say. The updated graphics look great. Some of the areas have gotten a lot more character, like the architectural office Sam and Henry is hiding in, the music shop, or the quarantine zone. In the original game, the QC really feels like this. An empty lot with some flat facades and really nothing happening. Like an old western town used for 60s movies. In the remaster, however, there's a lot more character and the place feels lived in. While in the original game the symbol of yellow color would guide you towards your destination or objects to interact with, in the remake it's not really as necessary. They have toned down on the yellow guide and instead use lighting and framing to subconsciously guide your direction. AI, lighting, shadows, water and most of the environments have gotten a big fidelity upgrade. Cutscenes have been cleaned up to focus more on the performances, removing background clutter. There are some upgrades to the character models as well. While they do look more high def, they also look somewhat different from their original version. Tess and Joel look significantly older, and Ellie has more in common with the Last of Us Part 2 version. While it does make sense, it at least to me feels like a disservice to the original. While I don't care too much what they do to the side characters, the original Joel and Ellie are somewhat imprinted in my mind, and seeing them portrayed this differently leaves a weird taste in my mouth. The realistic lighting and shadows does mean that we lose some of the strong colors seen in the original. It can look somewhat more washed out when you compare the two directly. As a result, the original can feel a bit more saturated and bright, while the remake feels cooler, darker and more realistic. However, if there is one reason as to why I'll do my next replays on the PC version instead of the PS4 version, it's because of those damn sexy gun upgrade animations. I mean, geez, look at it. It's so satisfying, and most of them are unique as well as looking like they make sense for an untrained rifleman. Since I've already played the PS4 version pretty recently, I figured why not try my hand at Grounded. But after a few instant deaths, I quickly changed my mind as I didn't want this video to take longer than it's already taken. So I changed it back to hard, but for some reason I did not regain listening mode, so it became kind of like a half-breed between the two difficulties. I do have to say that playing without listening mode is something I 100% recommend. It puts you more on the edge and brings an added layer of uncertainty to each encounter. I did have the advantage of recently playing it through on PS4, so I still remembered some guard paths and movements, but it did make my playstyle a whole lot more fluid and it felt more realistic and uninterrupted. Do I think the show is bad? No, it's actually pretty good. Like a solid 8 out of 10. For me, there are definitely frustrating choices that the creators made and creative changes that I struggle to understand, but for the standard of live-action video game adaptations put to screen, both in terms of cinema and TV shows, this is pretty much magnificent. The show was produced and developed by PlayStation Productions, which is a new endeavor from PlayStation, and it's their first show. The only other thing they've had under their belt is the Uncharted film, so pretty damn impressive. And I am looking forward to Season 2, as I think The Last of Us Part 2 would be a better fit for the TV medium than Part 1. This video was mostly made as a response to videos like Why Disloyal Adoptions Are Better, The Last of Us by the Closer Look, and other rhetoric showing overwhelming praise of the show. The Burback brothers have a video where they talk about the adaptations of The Last of Us and Uncharted, in which they reflect on the irony of making a movie about the Uncharted series. The Uncharted movie, of course, being inspired by the games, which in turn is inspired by the National Treasure film, which of course are inspired by the Tomb Raider games and films, which of course have been inspired by the Indiana Jones films, proving the point that the government are desperately conspiring to make archaeology look hot. I think the same or a similar comparison could be made about The Last of Us being heavily inspired by Children of Men, and that a film version of The Last of Us would just be Children of Men. From the font and title screen to the intro being the exact same, radio messages summing up the last 20 years.
The Homeland Security Bill is ratified. After 8 years, British borders will remain closed. The deportation of illegal immigrants.
The brutal totalitarian police state. A man in his late 40s who's lost a child having to escort the Cure for Humanity for a resistance group that starts with the letter F. the cure of humanity being a young woman or girl. Him doing this with a romantic love interest or partner who surprisingly dies, so he has to deal with the task alone. The resistance group and the main character coming at odds with each other and wanting different things for the girl. I would almost argue to the point that Children of Men is a more true adaptation of The Last of Us than the show in terms of style, cinematography and aesthetics. Children of Men has a way of doing these shots that stray from our main character for a few seconds and stays with the world or other humans experiencing the horrors of living in it. As well as showing graffiti and street art with tons of personality and story building in them. A subtle way to tell stories from beyond our characters without having to really change to a totally new POV and character. Something that in my opinion is more similar to what the game is doing with its storytelling. The film is famous for its immaculate use of long takes. Something that makes us feel like we don't get room to breathe or any pauses really at all. The Last of Us carries this feeling over to the video game medium, but leaves it behind when it goes to TV. Throughout my thoughts here, I've been very critical on the use of flashbacks or the inclusion of more POV characters. I think an interesting thing which the showrunners could have lifted from the game is how in the game you are very much locked into Joel's POV from the get-go. And how that plays on when the focus suddenly shifts to Ellie during the winter. It leaves us with a bit more feeling of how does she react to this? Will she be able to handle herself? In the game, this shift is so drastic that I wouldn't blame you if you thought Joel had died. And I think to a large part, that is what the game directors wanted you to think for a hot minute. You can watch this show and enjoy it, or you can experience the story. HBO can never make you press the square button. HBO can never make you rush to save Ellie against David. HBO can never let you beat Ellie and Sam in a game of dart. And for me at least, watching a character start caring for Ellie in the show, or me actually caring for her in the game, is just totally different feelings. If you want to experience more of The Last of Us after watching the show and playing the games, I highly recommend the books The Road and City of Thieves, which the game was based on. A pretty good book. The film Children of Men is basically a movie version of The Last of Us. I Am Legend with Will Smith, for a lot of its faults, it does carry similar themes and aesthetics of The Last of Us, as do The Road and Annihilation. I know that I'm probably gonna be biased as to what I like the most is the medium I first experienced this story in, but I would be surprised if someone who's experienced both game and show would prefer show. But whatever preference you have, please let me know in the comments. And I'm especially interested in someone going the other route of show first and then game. This is kind of like a new thing for me, so let me know if you liked it or if it sucks. Yeah. Let's get back to music, I guess.